All right, so I'm going to begin. I mean, hopefully, more people will show up, but I do want to begin already. So, all right, so we're talking about the Jews of Spain. We are like mid to the end of the 14th century. This is the era of the Reconquista, when the northern kingdoms, particularly Castile and Aragon, are going to move more southward in Spain, and they are going to conquer more and more land for the Christian kingdoms. And the only remaining Muslim enclave is going to end up being Granada, which is in like southeastern Spain, and it's actually, we're right on the coast there with the Mediterranean. But the country is not yet unified. That will only occur post mid-15th century. That's with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, right? And then they will consolidate their kingdoms, and they will then have a unified Spain. And then that, unfortunately, then leads to worse and worse conditions, for the Jews. But right now, we were talking about the fact these are separate kingdoms, right? They are not unified. But the Muslims have been pushed now into a smaller and smaller corner of Spain. Castile is central Spain, and then, of course, as it's moved southward, so it's going to take over a greater portion of the south as well. Aragon is more the northeastern part of Spain, and Castile already has a link up with Leon, which is northwestern Spain. Okay, but they are not a unified country. So there are a few key kingdoms, right? The chief of are Castile and Aragon. There's also Catalonia. There are other areas, but those are the chief ones. So I just wanted to have a general picture of what it looks like, in the physical domain of Spain. Last week, we had talked about what had happened. So initially, you have to understand, just like the Muslims, when they first came into Spain, they utilized the Jews who were using there for governmental posts, as financial advisors. So when the Christian monarchs first, start encroaching in more and more Muslim territory, they too will make use of the Jews and put them into key positions. The one position that they put them into, though, which will ultimately garner a lot of animosity among the general population, that they make them the tax collectors. And the same thing will happen when we study Eastern Europe. That also was a problem for the Jews in Poland. Over centuries from what we're talking about right now. But gradually, again, coupled with the fact that they're going to get more and more their position as Christians is going to become paramount to these countries, especially with Castile. It's interesting, most of the attacks on the Jews, they start in Castile, and then later they go to Aragon, but they start mostly in Castile. And the attacks, we'll learn there's certain key preachers, who are going to spew this hatred against the Jews, but you have to understand the undercurrent, so why would anybody listen to them? But first of all, there's been centuries now that they've been going to their churches and hear about how terrible the Jews are, and they killed their God, et cetera, and they're evil, and because they're the money lenders, and just accusing us, and then all these other horrible libels that have come up to the fore during this whole medieval period. So we already are being painted in a very ugly light. So they're very receptive now to when they will ultimately, unfortunately, the powers that be will rise to the fore and turn, against the Jews. So last week we had discussed the very first time that this becomes turns into actuality, and with attacks upon the Jews of Spain, and that's in the middle part of the 14th century. There was a civil war. It's in Castile, doesn't affect Aragon, just Castile. And there's a dispute between two brothers, half-brothers, One was Pedro and the other was Henry. Initially, Pedro is victorious, but then midway through, Henry takes over the reins of government. And Pedro, unfortunately, was backed by the Jews. And so when Henry had started his campaign, the war lasted for quite a long time, went from 1355 to 1369. He always, in the minds of the people who already are, anti-Semitic, again, from hearing the preachings, in the churches, he says, oh, well, those terrible Jews, and they're aligned with Pedro, and unfortunately, Henry in the end wins. All right, this is Henry II of Castile, and many Jews are killed and beaten. Property is confiscated from them, and it's really most horrible for those Jews living in Castile. And in the end, after things quiet down, Henry himself makes use of some of these Jews, in higher level positions. So, whatever, very unfortunate. I want to, before I go to the next terrible time period in Spanish Jewish history, I do want to talk about a few key Rabbanim who come out from this time period. So we had already learned this 13th century. We learned about the Rashba, and what an important influence. He was the following the Ramban, he becomes the chief rabbi of Barcelona, because Barcelona is Aragon. I'm not going to go in and repeat what I said about the Rashba, just so you know. He's then followed by the Rush, who actually was an immigrant from Germany. Times are very bad in Germany at this time period. He moves to Spain. And he then becomes also the, he had actually learned under Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who was considered to be the last of the Tosfos. Those are the Rabbanim from France and Germany, and their writings are in the Gemara, the Tosfos. So it's a compilation of various Rabbanim's opinions. And he doesn't go to Barcelona. He arrives in Barcelona, is befriended and welcomed by the Rashba, but then the Rashba, I guess, finds a position for him. He moves to Toledo, and that's where he is headquartered. And Toledo is south of modern day Madrid. So it's like central Spain. All right. So I don't think I'm going to repeat it. And the Russians just know that he's very famous. He also wrote some Tosfos, but they're not in the Tosfos body. It's actually in a separate, it's on a page, if you have one of those huge Gemaras, it's on, it's called Tosfei Harush. So he has his own little, half column there, so to speak, on the page. All right. So now let me tell you about the next great Rav, also from Toledo. He was a son of the Rush. The Rush had 8 sons. I know many daughters, but we just know how many sons he actually had. And his name is Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. All right, and he then will become the chief judge, of the court, and he's the Rav of Toledo. He, takes on the mantle of his great father, the Rush. He actually wrote sort of like a composition of, it's called Kitzur Piskei HaRush, in which he has, a synopsis of what his great father had written. But he is most famous for, and this is actually how his name, maybe when you hear the name, you will recognize it. He wrote a sefer called the Arba Turim, and he's known as the Baal Turim. And it was a compilation of a Jewish code of law, right, of halachic, pronouncements, which he had collected up until that time. Now, there already had been several efforts of Rabbanim in different time periods over the course of these several hundred years, who tried to organize the mitzvot in various ways. And of course, one of the key ones is the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. But his unique way of organizing the material, you'll see when I start discussing it with you, you'll see how the Shulchan Aruch, which is not till the 16th century, by Rabbi Yaakov Caro, it's based entirely on the Tours, the Baal HaTours way of organizing the material. So I'll explain that in a minute. Now, because he was writing, of course, in Gullus, so he eliminates, there's no mention whatsoever there, any laws regarding agricultural laws that would apply to, to the land of Israel, or any laws regarding karbanos, which of course are discussed, very heavily in the Gemara itself. But again, all the other mitzvot that we have, and this is how he organized it. So again, he's organizing everything into 4 categories. A tour is a row. So that's why there are 4 basic ways, right, of organizing it. One, you'll see it's exactly how the Shulchan Aruch is organized. One, it's called Orach Chaim, and that includes mitzvot, laws regarding daily prayer and ritual, Shabbos, and the holidays. Okay, then Yoredeya. This is actually, if you think about when a young man gets smicha, I don't know, at least from YU, I'm not sure how the other yeshivas are, it is based on the fact that you have mastered the laws of Yoredeya. Okay, and that includes dietary laws. There you learn about shechita, things like that, oaths, nida, mikveh, usury, and mourning. So these are all very common everyday, principles that we have to follow. So a rav, if I'm going to give somebody smicha, they have to be well versed in these various mitzvot. Another one is choshen mishpat. These are more legal things, legal evidence, courts, judges, witnesses, mercantile practice, damages. That's torts. I learned that once from a lady in my class who was a lawyer. So torts refers to damages, partnership, and inheritance. And the last one is Even Ha'ezer, and that deals with laws regarding marriage, divorce, and domestic relations. So dividing all of halacha into 4 major categories, this is what was then adopted. That same way of organizing in 4 separate sections will be found in the Shulchan Aruch, which will be compiled and written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, but 2 centuries later. So it's now considered the basic work, even though there are existing other works which, try to organize the halacha and the mitzvot in some sort of an organized fashion, but this will become the standard way of organizing halacha. And apparently he also wrote a biblical commentary, uses gematria, word comparisons, and he is obviously a highly respected individual, and had a profound influence on the Jews of Spain at that time. Now, I just want to give you his dates, because I told you what we just learned about that civil war that was taking place in Castile, that actually postdates him, all right, because that doesn't start till 1355, and he died already in the year 1340. But I didn't want to not mention him because he's such a famous individual. There are just 2 other, perhaps less well-known rabbanim from this time period. We don't actually even have their exact dates, but they come out of this time period. So sometime after the Baal HaTurim's era, or at the same time as the Baal HaTurim lived. One is a Rabbi David Abudraham, okay, and apparently he wrote a text on the basic Jewish prayer book, the Siddur, and it includes their notes in there on halacha, customs, traditions, even, like you've used an art scroll Siddur, maybe you're not sure, should you repeat something, or, it's in English, obviously, it tells you. So he put together compiled a Siddur. Again, this would have been based on Rav Amram Gaon's from the Gaonic period, his Siddur. That's like the basic Siddur, but now that some things have been added over time period, and then he's giving you actually there are notes there to tell you when to say certain things. All right, this Siddur itself is called Abudraham. That's how it's known, and it also includes the brachos, different customs that one would follow, when one should say the Shema, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and his sources were, where he came to determination of like when you should daven something or include or omit something. That it's all based on the Gemara. He looked both in the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. Those were his sources. And plus, he looked through obviously the writings of the Gaonim. Obviously, I'm sure as very heavily on Rav Amram Gaon because he wrote that first standard sitter that we follow. And he included some Sephardic customs, some Ashkenazic customs, and has his own comments as well that he adds. Okay, now there's one other Rav from this time period. Just want to mention his name, and his name was Rabbi Yitzchak Abohav. He wrote a book on ethics and devotions, and he called it Minorat HaMaor. And apparently it included a lot of agadic portions of the Gemara, which he felt, perhaps were not being studied as much as the halacha part of the Gemara. And he grouped everything by topics. And apparently it became ultimately an authoritative work for Jewish observance and thought, specifically for Sephardic Jewry, although centuries later, it actually became popular among Ashkenazic Jewry and was even translated into German and Yiddish. I thought this interesting. Okay, the last great Rav that I want to tell you about is the Ran. The Ran, he's the successor to the Rashba, so he's in Barcelona. It's interesting, see where they're all coming from. That Abu Draham, by the way, was from Seville. So some of them are in Castile. But when I said Barcelona, we're talking about Aragon. His dates are 1290. He lived till 1375. So he definitely lived in that era, right, of a civil war, but he's in Aragon. So it's not really affecting him so much. That battle between those two brothers, that was in Castile. And he was considered, again, to be, the foremost Rav of that era. And he would get his shayload, his questions from Jews all over the known world. They came obviously from parts of Europe, even Africa, even from some, it was a very small Jewish population, but even from Eretz Israel, people living there would have written to him, for his teshuvah, for his responsa. Apparently, he wrote an extensive commentary on the Rif. That's right, Alfasi, who wrote a book called Sefer HaHalachot. This goes back to the earlier time period of Spanish Jewry, all right? And he also includes his own commentary on what the Rif wrote. Apparently, he's also a great philosopher, and he wrote and defended, a lot of the basic beliefs of Judaism. And at this time period, we were already getting people, because times are so bad and they're being attacked. Unfortunately, a lot of Jews are starting to convert to Christianity. Well, it's only going to increase in time, but it is starting during this era. So he tried to, write works, in which he talks about, the basic fundamentals of Judaism, so that, Jews should try to understand, the important principles that lie behind the practice of Yahadus. And he calls this book, it's called Drashot Haran. And again, it includes all these things. Apparently, you go later as we go through, there are several Rabbanim. Apparently in the year 1367, okay. So we are now, remember, I'm telling you that war did not end until 1369. Again, even though it's in Castile, but he too, right? Believe me, it spreads. I mean, the thought processes. So he was arrested in the year 1367 with other Rabbanim, whose names we will mention at a later point. And obviously on trumped up charges of probably being disloyal to the powers that be. But eventually he was released unharmed. He did not believe in the study of Kabbalah at all. And as a result, he disapproved of some of the Ramban, that's Nachmanides, some of his writings, because he was very much influenced by Kabbalah. He felt it was like excessive, involvement with the study of halacha. And apparently, when he's much older, he started writing a Torah commentary, but he died before he finished that work. All right, so now I'm going to stop with just giving you a report, and we're going to go back to just the Jewish history aspect. Okay, so let me just make sure I have everything organized here properly. All right, now we're going to, okay, let me put those away, and now we're going to see what happened now. So there's a period of time we don't have as much information about it. So obviously things must have been semi-peaceful, okay? So that Brothers' War, right, that ends, right, in Castile in 1367. But now we're going to move on, and we're going to go to the latter part, almost the end, that last decade of the 14th century in Spain. And the priests rose to the fore there, and it began this awful, awful campaign against the Jews. And he got many, many followers, and we'll see what happened. And so it's the year 1391. When people study Spanish Jewish history, this is always taught as it's the beginning of the end. All right, and now I'll tell you a bit about what happened during that era. Make sure I have everything I want here. I have so many different pages. I got to keep it organized here as best as I possibly can. All right. Yes, this is good. Now I got the ones I want. All right. So who was it? Started by a man called Ferran Martinez. This is a non-Jewish person. He was actually the Queen Mother's confessor. And he starts fanning this anti-Jewish feeling, among the populace. So in the year 1378 already, he started preaching against, the Jews and inciting them they should rise up and they should go ahead and massacre the Jews. So they're already hearing this from him. And he must have been very charismatic, or they must have been an excellent speaker. So, but they're not acting upon it quite yet. All right. I'm talking about the general Spanish populace. And he had sort of like sort of a threefold thing of how he thought one should deal with this Jewish problem in Spain. So he says, one, let's go ahead and just destroy all their synagogues. Okay, that was great. Then he said, well, let's also establish a ghetto, a separate quarter. It's not necessarily always a walled city, but just a separate quarter where the Jews have to live. All right, so they will have zero contact with the Christians, who are living in Spain, and then to remove Jews from any positions whatsoever of influence. So this, of course, would be directed against the monarchs because they were the ones who were utilizing them. What happens then in the year 1390? Remember, so we're starting all this preaching in 1378, but it's not going to come to a head till 1390, then 1391 in particular. What happened in the year 1390 was that the Archbishop and the King of Castile both died. So Martinez became the administrator of the diocese then, right? Of Spain. Now remember, this is Castile again that we're talking about, and so at that point he galvanizes the populace that they should rise up and just destroy all the synagogues. This is taking place in Seville, and just so that Seville is that's definitely southern Spain. Okay, all right. I just want, because I have things in different places, so I just want to organize everything. All right. So what happened was the king, his name was John I, he died and left the throne to an 11-year-old boy. So you can see it was a time of, uncertainty. So that's why he was able to wrest control. And then, remember I said that the Archbishop had also died at that same time. So apparently, when he's sermonizing and talking against the Jews, so apparently a number of shuls literally were closed down. And he claimed, they were open, they didn't have the proper authorization, to have Jews. But he had another sermon was on March 15, 1391. And then he does start, the forces, the unrest among the Christian population is going to grow and increase. Now, if I'm telling you it's mid-March, right, 1391. So this is getting close to the holiday of Easter, which is also Pesach's around the same time. So I guess it started on Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday, remember, that's like in advance. they put that on. I don't know how much in advance of Easter. That's at least 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I don't know when they do that. But it's like their Christian fervor, has now arisen. And Easter, what is Easter celebrating? Well, they're saying, right, that Jesus was crucified. Was it Thursday, Friday? I can't remember. Easter's when he rises. Whatever. This is always. Certainly later for the Jews of Eastern, it's always a very dangerous time period for the Jews, because I don't know if you ever had the opportunity. I taught a course once on anti-Semitism. I had never before read the Gospels, but I did at that point, and I was really horrified, just horrified to read what's written in there. And this is what they, the priests get up in church. And this is what they read to them, the Jews. And then the Jews said, well, we're responsible for forever, that we're the ones who crucified Jesus. And so as a result, we're not just blaming the Jews who lived then in that first century CE. Oh, but the Jews through the generations, his blood is on their hands, whatever. So it's a great excuse to go out a mob scene and attack the Jews. So this is what he does, but it doesn't happen until June. So it's like festering, among the populace, but they don't actually act upon it until the June, which is Shavuos. Okay. So apparently, again, it starts in the city of Seville. There was nobody properly in control. I told you there's this child who's the king, right? Martinez, for all purposes, he's the head authority, again, starting in Seville, but it's going to spread throughout Castile and then go to Aragon even. And apparently they rose up, this mob, against the Jews of Seville, and they killed 4,000 of its 7,000 inhabitants. And then most of those people who survived were forcibly baptized, right? And the terror from there just spreads throughout Spain and Portugal, destroyed 70 Jewish communities, killed approximately 50,000 Jews, all told. It spreads eventually to Cordova, to Toledo, and some of these cities were just completely annihilated, just awful. And so again, 1391 is always looked upon, these are like the beginning of the death throes, for Spanish Jewry. I wanted to read from you. This is actually something, I'll discuss more about this, Rav, but he wrote an account of what it was like living then. And it's pretty powerful. Wait, not this safer. Wait, I got a few sperm. Okay, here, this one. It's actually a Jewish history book. Okay, and his name is Rabbi Chistai Kreskas. And this is what he's writing about what happened. If I were to tell you here all the numerous sufferings we have endured, you would be dumbfounded at the thought of them. I will therefore set before you only in brief detail the table of our disaster. I will recount it as briefly as possible, commencing as follows. On the day of the new moon, Rosh Chodesh, of the faithful month of Tammuz, in the year, it's 5151, that's July, all right, 1391. The Lord bent the bow of the enemies against the populous community of Seville, where there were between 6,000 and 7,000 heads of families, and they destroyed their gates by fire and killed in that very place a great number of people. The majority, however, changed their faith. Many of them, children as well as women, were sold to the Muslims, so that the streets occupied by Jews have become empty. Many of them, sanctifying the holy name, endured death, but many also broke the holy covenant. From there, the fire spread and consumed all the cedars of Lebanon. I mean, this is a flowery way of writing about it. In the holy community of the city of Cordova. And here, too, many changed their faith, and the community became desolate. Then he talks how it's going to spread to Toledo. And this is where, there were very learned men there who were murdered. He says, in that very place, the rabbis and the descendants of the virtuous and excellent Rav Elsher, that's LaRoche, who I talked about before, who has his Tosfei Harash, that's in the Gemara. and together with their children and their pupils, publicly sanctified the holy name. Many who had not the courage to save their souls changed their faith here too. So what you're going to see that during these awful, awful attacks, I guess you can call them pogroms, or the pogrom really refers to the attacks on the Jews of Eastern Europe by the Tsar, that, well, many Jews are going to be massacred. And in contradistinction to the Jews of Ashkenaz, who did give up their lives, al Kiddush Hashem, the Jews of Spain, and not to fault them, I mean, I don't know if I would be in their place, but many of them succumbed, they're about to be put to death, and many of them decided to convert instead to save themselves and their families. And it's going to increase. So a huge number, I would say at least half of the Jews of Spain convert to Christianity, during this time period. Then it tells you later on, in the month of the Lord destroyed mercilessly the community of Valencia, right? So let me just take here. Valencia is, now we're going further north, but on the coast, all right? In the Mediterranean, so on the eastern side of Spain. And he says many died there, about 300 people, sanctifying the holy name, and others changed their faith. The following Shabbos, this mob enters Barcelona. So now that we're in Aragon already. Before we were talking a lot about Catalonia, not Catalonia, Castile, and now we're going into Aragon. And this is a sad thing. Again, now he's writing this account, describing what happened to the Jews in all these various communities. So the enemies plundered the streets, set fire to them. Among the many who sanctified the name of the Lord was my only son, who was a bridegroom. So I read it in one source, he was about 20 years old, and whom I have offered as a faultless lamb for sacrifice. So I can imagine how painful this must have been for him to have to write about this, I submit to God's justice and take comfort in the thought of his excellent portion and his delightful lot. Whatever many others, of course, are also put to death. Some do it al Kiddush Hashem. They martyred themselves, but many, many others, right? They changed their faith. They accept Christianity. Then this is what he writes at the end of this account. He says, and a lot of those who actually converted are actually some of the wealthier people. Those are the ones who did it. There is none left in Barcelona today who still bears the name of Jew. Can you imagine? I mean, this was a great, great center of Jewish learning. And look how it just disappears, in 1391. Then he goes to the town of Lerida, also in the north, Girona, that's a city north of Barcelona. And then were the state of Valencia, not one single Jew remained. And in the province of Catalonia, also not one Jew remained, et cetera, et cetera. Those of us who are still in the country of Aragon, the Lord has taken pity on us and has preserved the remnant of us in all these places. Fear fills our hearts and our eyes are directed toward our Father in heaven. I am the man that hath seen all this affliction by the rod of Hashem's wrath. He says, and he writes, he lived in Saragossa. Okay, Saragossa is inland west of Barcelona. Okay, so just wanted to, I think it's more of an impact when you read somebody who actually lived at that time period and then writes about this, and had to write about the death of his only son. So I'm sure how very, very painful this was. So this was a really, as I said, this is the beginning of the end here. I guess we should pause here maybe to try to think and explain the position of the conversos. They're called anusim. That means people who were forced. I mean, they weren't adopting this because they thought that Christianity was they saw the light, and that Christianity was a far superior religion to Judaism. I mean, they feel they have no choice. They want to save their lives. Now, among them, we know, were many who obviously outwardly would then practice Christianity and secretly in their homes, live their lives as Jews. Some of them really adopted Christianity and, look, they wanted to save themselves. And eventually they will disappear. They will no longer be recognized and as the centuries go on, even as Jews anymore. So it's these conversos who sort of are in this in-between thing. And I feel that they're really caught, They did try to hold on to whatever semblance of Judaism that they could, but it always had to be hidden. They were always in fear that people would see, that they weren't really being devout Catholics, could report them to the authorities. This is before the Inquisition. The Inquisition, now this is, remember I told you this is 1391. There already have people who have converted to Christianity, and there will be many more still to come. But the Inquisition itself, as an institution, does not start until the year 1480, and they're expelled in 1492. So this is not the time period, they're not being arrested and tortured horribly and burned at the stake. That will not happen till, I told you, from 1480 to 1492. All right, so just bear this, in mind. It's hard to say. I mean, we hear the numbers here, hundreds here, thousands here, thousands there. I don't know. At one point, perhaps, I don't know. In the different records, we didn't have population statistics. There could have been as many as 400 to 500,000 Jews living in Spain, at a certain point. Even when we talk about the expulsion, I've seen figures of 100,000. I've seen figures of 200,000. Well, there were at least an equal number who were conversos, and then there was a certain number who had adopted Christianity years prior to that. So I'm saying it was a very, very large Jewish community, but those who actually left were only a portion. Many, remained behind, but obviously not living outwardly as Jews at all at that point. Let me make sure I covered everything I wanted to tell you. Now we're going to go through a time period now of about 20 years, very unstable, very difficult time period, for the Jews of Spain. And we're going to come now to another terrible occurrence. We're now into the 15th century, and this is the year 1412. What happened then? This is what I want to tell you at this point. Okay. All right. Okay. So we're going to come to what's known ultimately as the Disputation of Tortosa, just so you know exactly where Tortosa is. That is south of Barcelona. From my map here, it looks like it's slightly inland, but it's near the coast. It's, near the Mediterranean, but on the eastern side of Spain, okay, south of Barcelona. What happened was there was, now this is Aragon, just bear in mind, okay, before we talked about starting in Castile and then the mobs spreading into Aragon. Now there's going to be this other incident that's going to occur. And before we learned about this Martinez guy, who was the preacher who was responsible, now we have another preacher. His name is Vincent Ferrer, Ferrer. And there too, he must have been a powerful speaker, was able to influence the people at that time, for this outpouring of anti-Semitic sentiment. He is helped. This part is a bit sad. Let me get to my proper pages here that I wanted to tell you about. Let's see, hold on. He's helped by an apostate. I always find that's so distasteful, when I learned about that. And his name was Paul of Burgos. That's another town in Spain, Burgos. Can you imagine this? His original name was Shlomo Halevi, and he was actually a Rav. I mentioned this last time when we had the lecture. I just cannot imagine how these people lived with themselves. They're responsible for the deaths of so many Jews, and they themselves were once part of that glorious community. Really, really sad. So the two of them in conjunction, are going to, rile up the mob at that time period. They were vicious Jew haters. And what happened was, believe it or not, this Paul of Burgos, who I just mentioned, the apostate Jew, he actually rose to the position. He was the archbishop. Great. And what had happened was the king had died, and they're now an infant king. Like the other time, what was the problem? There was this 11-year-old boy who was, in charge. It's always you're taking advantage of a position, of a time period, of instability, and then these rabble rousers, rise to the fore. So it's instigated by this Vincent Ferrer, but then this apostate Jew is like more than happy to help him. And he draws up all this anti-Jewish legislation. In the year 1412, Jews were evicted from their homes, which were confiscated, given to Christians. They were confined to certain quarters of the cities, and they even had to wear a special dress. I mean, this sort of all was in existence. I mean, even under Muslim rule, some of these things, were enforced probably to a lesser degree, but they did already exist. Jews were excluded from various professions, from certain business ventures. And again, it was this Paul of Burgos, the apostate Jew. He's the one who wrote all these things. I guess he was a very excellent, had great command of the language. So he was the one who wrote down, all these anti-Jewish legislation. But believe you me, there are other people, involved and helped him. So trying to see where exactly did this guy come from. Okay, right. So it starts in Castile. All right, but you'll see it's going to move to Aragon. So again, he publishes all these laws, undermining Jewish life, etc., abolishing the political independence of the Aljama. The Aljama, that's the Jewish communities. And again, we know the Jews were confined to separate residential things, had to dress differently. This is interesting. I found in one source, it said they had to, we always think of like the yellow badge or something. It said part of the restrictions, on their physical appearance was, this would be for men, that they had to let their hair and their beards grow long. And, they used to be, many Jews, especially, the wealthier class, would have been addressed as Don, like sir, so-and-so. So they said, no, you can't do that anymore. Although it's interesting, later on will be the next, later in the century, we'll learn of Abarbanel. And he was known as Don Yitzchak Abarbanel. So he obviously, but you'll find maybe Shalom will talk more about him. He lived most of his life in Portugal, actually. All right. More laws, it's those of us, we know the different publications against the Jews in Nazi Germany. So many of the things like I'm reading, I'm thinking, oh my God, they were put into effect as law, under the Nazis. They couldn't hold government posts anymore. And again, they didn't even allow them at that point in time to be the tax farmers. I mean, the people who would collect the taxes. If you were a physician, you couldn't treat Christian patients, just whatever. And it affected the Jews also in Mallorca. I didn't mention Mallorca last time, but they were also attacked. Mallorca is actually an island off the coast, sort of closer, it's like between Barcelona and Valencia, in the Mediterranean is the island of Mallorca. And there's the capital city is Palma. That's where many Jews did live. So, all these ugly promulgations are now affecting a larger and larger area. And now we're going to go into the disputation of Tortosa. Now so you have to understand already the climate, what's going on here. That this Vincent Ferrer, right, has now riled up the whole population. The laws passed against the Jews, and written by none other than the apostate, this Paul, right, of Burgos. And now the Pope. Now he's called the anti-Pope, remember I told you sometimes there were 2 popes, sometimes there were 3 popes, I don't know, whatever. He's called the anti-pope. His name was Pope Benedict III. So just like in the year 1263, remember there's a big disputation in Barcelona between the Ramban, right, and trying to defend, the Jewish faith, among all these ecclesiastical monks, whatever they were, who trying to discuss, the merits of the 2 religions, all right. But in that case, actually, James I, who was the king, presided, and he actually, in the end, although of course they would say the winners, of course, were the Christians, but he himself was so very impressed with the Ramban, I'm saying about Nachmanides, with his arguments, he actually gave him like a very large sum of money because he was, just blown over, by how eloquent the Ramban was. Okay, now things are going to be different now. We're talking about, so that was 1263, and now we're up to 1414. It lasted over a year. Again, it's called for by this Pope, Benedict III. And they had appeared in Tortosa. And Tortosa, again, that's south of Barcelona. Okay, town. I don't mean just south. I mean, it's a bit of a distance, but it's down the coastline from Barcelona. And it began in February. Apparently, it was in this huge auditorium. It was draped, apparently, with these gorgeous, like purple drapes. And they had up to 2,000 people who were in attendance. It was, it attracted a lot of people who were going to see this debate between the Christians and the Jews. The spokesperson for Christianity was an apostate Jew. How lovely of him. His name was Geronimo de Santa Fe, I guess. And he was also obviously, unfortunately, a very eloquent spokesperson against the Jewish faith. It's so interesting. So many of the times when these apostate Jews converted, they couldn't come down on what was written in the Torah per se. Their accusation is always what's in the Talmud. Like this becomes, like that awful text. It's quintessentially Jewish, and how terrible are the pronouncements, that are in it. The Jews had the delegation of the Jews was several different Rabbanim. One of the key spokespersons was a Rabbi Yosef Albo. I'll talk about him separately later, his accomplishments. But they couldn't speak to one another prior to the tribunal. Apparently he met 69 times. Can you imagine? And he, so they couldn't consult. So apparently some of those initial sessions were very disorganized. It's not, usually like lawyers, will discuss the case together, and then so they're all coming with a unified front. So it probably, as a result, the Jewish viewpoint was somewhat scattered, in how it was presented. But eventually, they sort of either on their own that they got together, or just in general, they got more confident in their arguments. But of course, it was like predetermined that the Christian side is going to be proven to be, the winner. They discussed 2 key things. One, of course, I already mentioned, the Talmud and how terrible it is, and so it's so anti-Christian. I know I've been going through the Gemara now for over a year. I don't talk about Christianity at all. I mean, I do know that there are some things or some allusions, but it's a huge compendium of halacha and agada, and believe me, they're not wasting their time. First of all, they were the Rabbanim in Babylonia, so what was their interest so much in writing that much about Christianity? In any case, but that's what they're going to focus on, those passages, right, that they feel are antagonistic to Christianity. And so they talked about the Mashiach, and of course they believe he's come. The Jews say he hasn't. So the argument, went back and forth. But the last, usually like in a court of law, the defense has the last word. But here it was the accusers, who had the last word. So whatever the rabbi said, it was always countermanded by this apostate Jew by Geronimo. And of course, all along the pressure for these Jews to convert, it's unrelenting. And it wasn't just those key spokespersons. I mean, this is among the entire Jewish community. They're constantly being pressed, convert. We are the true inheritors, of the faith. And many people did convert, unfortunately. So when we look back, there are like 3 key time periods in which Jews converted to Christianity. Of course, after that 1391, those terrible physical attacks upon them, many converted then. Now, also during the time period of this Vincent Ferrer and his, and then those laws that he had written up by that Paul of Burgos during that time period. So that's like 1411, 1412. And now, as a result of this Tortosa disputation. So we're going to have another huge wave of conversions that are going to take place. And so that lasted from, let's say, 1413 to 1415. So they feel that by the time, I'm telling you, by the time we get to the expulsion in 1492, already several 100,000, or I'd say, or at least 200,000 of the Jews of Spain had converted to Christianity. I mean, it's just sort of like mind-boggling. So I'm going to pause here, because hopefully Sholem is going to link on. So I have to, make sure I go over with him and get everything accurate, so that next week you can hear him talk. And I'll talk to you more about, I still obviously have to finish the Jews of Spain. So what happened to them after this, until we get to 1492. But he'll start telling you what's going on in the Portuguese Jewish community, which was